This Sunday we mark one of the 7 big feasts of the year, the Feast of the Holy Trinity. To honor the feast, I wanted to share 3 thoughts with you. The first thought is a prayer. It's one of my favorites, and it's attributed to Saint Ionikos, a shepherd who became a soldier, who became a monk famous for his asceticism and for working wonders. He fell asleep in the Lord on November 4th in the year 846. Now, most of the life of a monk is spent praying the Psalms, and tradition tells that he would say this prayer in between each verse of each psalm he prayed. My hope is the Father, my refuge is the Son, my shelter is the Holy Spirit. O Holy Trinity, glory to you. The second thought is a quick reflection on the first lesson for Trinity Sunday this year, the first account of God's creating in the book of Genesis. Here's just the very beginning of that reading. When God began to create heaven and earth, and the earth then was welter and waste and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. And it was evening, and it was morning, first day. I hope you'll read aloud for yourselves or for loved ones the whole passage, from the beginning of chapter 1 to verse 4 of chapter 2. It's a familiar story, so I invite you to go slowly, to drink in God's act of creation, to imagine the first person of the Trinity, whom we most often call the Father, but sometimes call the source of all being or the Holy One. To imagine, perhaps, an artist who doesn't see a blank canvas, but sees instead the painting that she'll bring forth, brush stroke by brush stroke. To also imagine the source not as a solitary artist, but with company. For the Word, the second person of the Holy Trinity, was also in the beginning with God. And through the Word all things came into being. And what has come into being through the Word is life, the light of all people. Remember as you imagine that an artist painting is too small a metaphor for the creation of all life that is so marvelously intertwined and interdependent. Think back to God's breath hovering over the waters as creation begins. The warm breath that Jesus will breathe upon the disciples as they gather in fear in the upper room on the evening they've first learned of the resurrection. And after breathing on them, Jesus tells them to receive the Holy Spirit. God's breath in creation, the Spirit's movement in our midst, still billows our sails and sends us to live as the disciples of Jesus. And we hear the first story of creation as encouragement that we are part of God's new creation, restored and reinvigorated to love with the same fierceness that God shows in the resurrection. A third and final thought for Trinity. Years ago, I was asked about my political views. In that moment, a line I had read recently popped onto my lips. Our social program is the dogma of the Holy Trinity. What does that even mean? Well, as simply as I can put it, I rejoice in the Trinity because of the good news that God is both three and one. We're never meeting just one person of the Trinity. When God creates, it's not just the source acting, but acting through the Word and by the Spirit's breath. The fancy theological term that tries to describe God is perichoresis, from the Greek word for rotation, a kind of awe-inspiring dance. God is indivisible and one and exists and reveals God's own self as community. And so what does that have to do with politics? Well, my faith in God and Christ calls me to life and compels me to love. Through God's precious and very great promises, We're being invited to become participants in the divine nature. So we're called to live like that now, to live like God now, to love all others in and through and with God, to choose to reach out a hand to lift up those who have been cast down by society and its structures, to break down barriers and divisions and all that oppresses and marginalizes. My hope is the Father. My refuge is the Son. My shelter is the Holy Spirit, O Holy Trinity. Glory to you. And now God, the Holy Trinity, strengthen you in faith and hope and love, guide you in peace and defend you on every side. And the blessing of God, source of all being, eternal Word and Holy Spirit, be among you and remain with you always.